Hi and welcome to Photo IQ. I'm your instructor, Gus Cantivero, and this is Unit 8 for Camera Basics. We're going to discuss the exposure triangle and your three primary controls for getting exposure. Let's get started. Learning how to properly expose your images is one of the more complicated tasks to learn in photography, and this is therefore going to be one of the more complicated technical lessons that we're going to cover. But I'm going to do my best to try and make this simple with diagrams and explanations and examples that you can grab onto in order to understand these concepts. I don't necessarily have a problem with using automatic functions, and you shouldn't be ashamed that you use them. But the point of Photo IQ is to raise your photography knowledge and get you to understand how the camera works and why you get the results that you get, so that you can take control over your creativity and create the photos that you want to create. Not just necessarily let the camera drive for you and make those exposure decisions. You'll see with the diagram next to me, this is an old diagram. The exposure triangle is something that's been around for a long time that instructors have used to teach the concepts and the three controls of your camera. The three controls that you're going to be concerned with is your ISO, which basically is the sensitivity or the speed at which your sensor takes in and reads light. So you want to think about it in terms of boosting the gain or the signal of your sensor, the digital sensor, to tell it how sensitive you want it to be to the light that it's going to be exposed to. The next control on the right-hand side of the triangle is the shutter speed, and that is measured in fractions of a second. At the top of the triangle on shutter speed, it's the faster part, and it's 1/250th of a second. Moving down to the slower part of the triangle, which is 1 second. So each time you open up the shutter speed and allow it to go longer, it's going to let in more light. With ISO on the left-hand side, less light is on the bottom and more light is on the top. So 100 being slow, 6400 being very fast, very sensitive. So think of it as walking 1 mile an hour versus running 6.4 miles an hour. The next control on the triangle is at the bottom, and that's the aperture, which is measured in f-stops. That is also referred to as the iris. It is the size of the opening of your lens. So in this illustration that I created for you with very simple little pictographs, little icons, you can see that on the left-hand side you have your light source, and that here is represented by the sun. That then travels into the aperture, which is the size of the opening of the lens. Then it travels through the shutter, and the shutter speed is measuring the time of the opening. Then lastly, it reaches the sensor of the camera, which is measured in ISO, and that is the sensitivity that you set. So it goes from the light into the lens. You determine the size of the opening, how much light you want to allow in. Then you control the shutter speed, which is how long you open it for. And then lastly, it hits the sensor. So think of it in terms, at least the first two controls, think of it like water traveling through a pipe. The aperture is the size of the pipe. Then the shutter speed is how long you open the valve. So how much water is coming through? It could be a huge pipe, but you could only open that valve for a really, really short time. Not a lot of water is going to get through. Conversely, you could have a really small pipe, but you could leave the faucet open for a really long time, and that's going to allow a lot of water through. Let's cover some terms here so that we can understand what we're talking about apples to apples. A stop, which is a term that you've already heard me use many times, and it's a very common term in photography. It's a term that you're going to want to know. It is a doubling or a halving of light. So, for example, I have one for each of the three controls so that you can understand. ISO 400 is one stop greater or double the sensitivity of ISO 200. Think of that as walking 4 miles an hour versus 2 miles an hour. You're doubling your speed and the amount of ground that you're covering. F11 is one stop smaller than F8, and so it is half the light transmission. The numbers in the f-stop they don't double. 8 to 16 is not doubled because we're talking about a diameter here, and it's an area, it's a ratio in terms of the size of the lens and the focal length and things like that. We don't need to concern ourselves with how that number is arrived at. Just try to memorize what the stop numbers are, and that the larger the number, the smaller the opening. The smaller the number, the larger the opening. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. A shutter speed of 1/30th of a second is slower and one stop more than 1/60th. Now some more terms for you. Depth of field. I've talked about this many times, and I think just by the words you might be able to guess what that might mean, but just specifically here speaking, the depth or distance of what is in focus. The aperture controls the amount of light entering, but also affects how much is in focus. Some lenses have a scale on them to help estimate this. Now I have a visual example I'm going to show you in just a moment, but let's look at the diagram that we have here. On this aperture scale, you can see very clearly f22, the highest number, is a very, very small very small opening. It allows in a very small, restricted amount of light. Now, the opposite end of the scale, f2, not all lenses are going to go up to f2, but many prime lenses will go to f2 and beyond, f1.8, f1.4, and thereabout. Most zoom lenses will max out at f2.8, and most consumer zoom lenses will max out at f3.5 or f4. So you can see that f2, being a very big opening, is going to allow a lot of light in, and that's going to be ideal for nighttime photography. If you refer over to the lens that's pictured in the illustration, you'll see that there is, on the bottom side of now the lens is held vertically so you can read the numbers, but on the bottom of the lens, this is the aperture control ring. Then you have a locked-in static ring here. This ring does not move. This is your focus scale. And that goes, you'll see from the outside, 22, 16, 8, and 4. And then there's a center line. That center line is your focus point. That's your focus point, and it's also the point which you line up your aperture number. So once this 8 has lined up with this large line in the center, you are at f8. Your aperture has been set to 8. And then if you look at the numbers beside it, 4 and 8, what that refers to is everything within those focus points on your focus scale, your distance scale, should be relatively in focus. Not necessarily tack sharp focus, but it will be in focus. That top part is, of course, the focus ring. On the far right side, you can see that there's feet on the top, meters on the bottom. So when you line up, as I have here in this illustration, 3 feet is lined up right with your focus point. That's exactly what's going to be in focus. If you were to take a tape measure and measure out to 3 feet, that is going to be your pin sharp focus point. But you can see that because of the focus scale, f8 is a little bit off to the left and a little bit off to the right. So everything within that point and that point are going to be in focus, relatively speaking. So since we don't have exact specific numbers on here, we can basically guess what this is going to be. And because 3 feet is in focus, the next number on the right is 4 feet. So it's going to be right in the middle of there. It's going to be about 3.5 feet. And then on the left side, the near side, closer to us, that's going to be around, let's see, we're given 2.5, let's say 2.6, 2.7 feet, so something right around there. That's going to be our focus point. Okay, so I have an image example here where I'm going to talk about the focus scale. And I have this image, which I set up as a still life on my tabletop. And it's obviously not the most beautiful still life, but it does illustrate a point here. One is that the camera right now is set to f16. And according to our focus scale, if you come back over to here, you can see that everything between this number and this number, okay, is going to be in focus. So in this image, I have the near sugar bowl at 29 inches. Then I have the middle Japanese cup at 35 inches. And then I have the German Stein in the distance at 41 inches. So 35 inches being just about 3 feet. And that's the face of the cup I measured at 3 feet. So the center of it is about 36 feet. So according to this scale, everything from about 4 feet to just under 2.5 feet should be in focus. So if I zoom in, you can see the focus mark of 3 feet right there. And that's in focus. And then if we come closer, the focus starts to get fuzzy right around between 29.5 inches, let's say. And then if we go to the distance, the Stein, which I measured at 41 inches, is still relatively in focus. Now, it is sharper here on the mug, but I would say that's, pretty acceptable, especially if you zoom out. It's hard to tell the distance between here and here. They both look like they're in focus. If you zoom way in, then you can tell the difference. But for an image that you are just going to share on social media or even print, you would be able to print this pretty large and still not be able to tell. So that image is at f16. You can see it right here. Let's go to the next one, see if we can tell a difference. So this one I went 2 stops. I went from f16 to f8. I bypassed f11. Let's get closer. The cup is still totally in focus because I haven't changed the focus on my lens. But you can see it's gotten a little softer here on the sugar bowl. Now the focus is getting soft in the near side at around 33 inches or so. If we go back here, you can see that this is starting to get soft. Let's go back and forth. Here to here. You can see a difference. Let's look at the measuring tape. Here, focus is pretty good right here at 29. And then the next image. A big difference. Let's go to the next one. f5.6. It's gotten even closer. Now the focus starts to fall off at right around 34 inches. So you can see at f8, see the difference? It's much more dramatic if you're looking over here. Go to the next one, f4. Now it's gotten pretty dramatic. You really can't see the detail anymore in the Stein. Let's come back to the sugar bowl. That's a big difference. Now if we zoom out, you can see that the mug is really starting to separate itself from the foreground and the background. But we can go even further than that. Here's f2.8. And then here's f2. Now it really starts to have that three-dimensional quality where the mug is standing out pretty substantially from the background. You can see that the focus point, if we zoom way in, right around 35 inches. So when I measured 35 inches on the tape measure, and then I measured the focus point to that, it was exactly right. Exactly correct. And look at the sharpness on the cup. The little bumps in the lacquer, the paint. You can see so much detail. So once again, if we compare the two, this is f2 and this is f16 on the left. And look at the difference between the Stein in the background and the sugar bowl in the foreground. Look at the difference between the tape measure. So I hope this illustrates very clearly what your aperture and the depth of field is in practice. Briefly, let's talk about what the f-stop actually means. The f-stop, the aperture, and the iris all refer to the lens opening. Now the iris and the aperture are the physical, that's the same thing, but it's the physical component that opens and closes. The f-stop is the number, the measurement of where your lens is currently situated. So the iris of the aperture, that's the physical element. The f-stop is the measured number of it. So your shutter speed is the speed at which your shutter opens and closes, but the shutter is the physical element. The f number represents a ratio of the diameter of the lens at each f-stop opening. So f2 is a bigger number than f16. Think of it like a fraction. 1/2 is larger than 1/16. Larger apertures let in more light because it's a bigger pipeline, a bigger throughput. Now some terms about shutter speed. The shutter speed is the speed at which your shutter opens and closes. Slow shutters create blur of motion, while fast shutters freeze the action. Slow shutter lets in more light. Faster shutters reduce it. This is represented by whole seconds and fractions of seconds. For example, 2 second, 1 second, half second, quarter second, and so on. Let's go back into Capture One so that we can see an example of the shutter speed in action. So I have this image of my dining room, and if we zoom in all the way up here on the fan blades, so that we have something in motion in the shot, because otherwise it's just a still life. There's nothing moving here other than the fan blade. So if we zoom up here, you can see that it's quite blurred. And the setting that I have here is 1/30th of a second. Not even really that slow. But 1/30th of a second is just enough where something that's moving rather quickly would be blurred pretty substantially. So let's say that we want to maintain our exposure, but we want to show the fan blade being frozen in action. So we go from 1/30th of a second to 1/60th of a second. Okay, we're still not there yet. Then to 1/25th of a second. Well, it's still a little bit blurry. Let's go to the next one. 2/50th of a second. That's pretty good. That's been frozen pretty good. So I think we're happy with that one. But how is it possible that I was able to maintain my exposure even though I sped up my shutter speed from 1, 2, 3 full stops? Well, I had to compensate. I wanted to keep my depth of field the same, so my aperture was locked at f5.6. Well, what I did was I increased the sensitivity of my ISO, my sensor speed. So I was at ISO 500, and what's double 500? It's 1000. So keep your eyes down here on the settings. It went from 500 to 1000, and then to 2000 because I went one stop faster on my shutter speed. I had to go one stop faster on my ISO. One more time. Doubled again. I went from 1/25th to 2/50th of a second. Therefore, I had to go from ISO 2000 to ISO 4000. Next, some technicalities about ISO. ISO is not a magic cure-all to make your camera more sensitive. There is a downside to it. ISO is the film or sensor rating, the speed at which your film or your sensor gathers the light. Higher is more sensitive, lower is less. To become more sensitive, the camera boosts the sensor's power, which increases image noise. And you can see in the close-up image that we have here, I took a photo of this carved coconut husk, which I got in Cambodia. And you can see a blow-up of the shadow side where the noise is apparent because I've boosted the ISO sensitivity. In the days of film photography, film would come in a preset ISO rating, a speed rating, so that if you were shooting in broad, bright daylight, you might choose an ISO 100 or 160. If you were shooting indoors or in a shadow scene, you might choose ISO 400. If you were shooting at night or at a night party or something like that, you might choose ISO 1600 or even 3200. But whatever film you loaded into the camera, you would then use your top dial to set what your film speed was. And then your camera's meter would adjust accordingly to tell you what your required f-stop and shutter speed would have to be in order to maintain proper exposure. If you needed to change your environment and change your scenario, you'd have to take the film out and put different film in, which could be a waste of film. It's also extremely inconvenient to have to change your film depending on what environment you're in. You have to plan ahead quite a lot. Now that we have digital cameras, the sensor is flexible. It can be changed depending on whatever situation we're in. So if you took one photo in a night environment, and then the next time you used your camera was the next day in bright daylight, you could just as easily just change the ISO and readjust for that. It's made photography so much more efficient and so much more accessible. With high-speed film, like ISO 3200, it would produce a very large grain pattern in the image. And that would sometimes be desirable for a very gritty look, but sometimes it would also be distracting if you were trying to take a very pretty portrait in daylight or something like that, and you wanted nice, smooth, soft skin. Instead, you would end up with something that was like sandpaper, and it's not really something that's super attractive in a lot of scenarios. So likewise, when ISOs are pushed to higher numbers, because you're talking about a digital signal, the camera is having to boost that signal, and it would be creating large pattern noise in the image, which is not as attractive as the cool looking, gritty, large grain film. And the reason that grain was large in high-speed film is because it was larger in order to absorb more light. When it was a lower speed film, it would be really tight grain pattern because the grain would have to be very small in order to reduce the speed at which it exposed. So when sensors are pushed to high ISOs, they produce digital artifacts called noise, which is ugly and distracting. It can be reduced in post-processing. It doesn't mean it can be magically cured or reduced and eliminated. It'll still be there to some degree, but it will be reduced to make it smoother and blend with the image more, especially if it's going to be displayed small, like on an Instagram post or something like that. You'll never see that noise pattern. Sometimes the noise can have colored fringing to it or something. So when you're looking at a dark shadow, it could actually have like a red kind of ugly presence in there, which it clearly does not exist if you're looking at a dark shadow. It's basically just acting like it's guessing as to what that color should be. So it's going to fill in some different color noise, and it's an imprecision in the way that the camera's processing that image signal. It's not necessarily saying, yeah, there's red in that dark wall. It's just, it doesn't know what else to do, and when you boost the signal, it just creates these kind of side effects that occur. So when you use post-processing to eliminate noise patterns, it's going to be analyzing the photo, looking at what the colors ought to be, and then dropping those red tones and blue tones or magenta tones and making sure that they all kind of smooth over. It doesn't mean that when you zoom in really close, that the image is going to be perfect. It won't be, but it will make it look pretty presentable. Modern digital sensors are more sensitive every year, and the noise quality is improving. Consumer cameras typically max out at 6400 with good results, and high-end cameras can take usable photos up to ISO 20000 and beyond. Film is pre-calibrated for color sensitivity, while digital images can be adjusted afterward when shot in RAW. So another drawback or limitation of film is that you have to choose the color sensitivity. Not only would you have to choose the ISO of your film, the film speed, but you'd also have to choose if you were going to be shooting in tungsten light or in daylight or shadow or something like that. Kodak and Fuji made films that were pre-calibrated, pre-adjusted to be more flattering for skin tones, or maybe more vibrant for nature photography. But once it was loaded into the camera, it was very difficult afterward to process that color and make it more flattering. You would have to make good decisions before. Now that we have RAW, we're able to adjust the white balance after the fact. Now, it's still good practice to set the white balance on your camera, and if you want to shoot JPEG in order to have lower storage sizes, then you definitely have to make sure that you're setting the correct white balance. Otherwise, the camera's not going to know what white is. Now, to talk a little bit more in depth about ISO, I have a visual example here for you, as I have with the other two controls. So here's that previously mentioned carved coconut. And if you zoom in here, this image was taken at a very high ISO, ISO 20000. So you can see in the bright areas that the detail is actually pretty good. We can zoom in really close We're at 300% here, and you can see it starts to get a little watercolory. You know, the precision, the detail is not quite there. If we zoom out, it looks pretty good. It's not bad. When we go over to the shadow area, look at what's going on here. The lack of smoothness on the wall. There are some controls for reducing noise. And if we go over to this little magnifying tool here, you can see that there's sharpen and then there's noise reduction, which is on by default. If we pull that down, that's actually what the image looks like. It's because it was on by default, it was actually smoothing it over. It was suppressing it. So if we turn it up, let's go all the way to the end. See how smooth it becomes? But we've also lost a lot of detail, especially in the out of focus area. Let's come back over to the front, this area, and just check it out. Let's turn off that noise reduction again. The brighter areas are prioritized by the camera. So it's definitely looking better in the brighter areas. But whenever you go into a shadow area, it really starts to get messy. So if we turn that back on, you can very quickly see the difference in here. We're at 100% here. We can zoom in even further than this. There's 300% off. Wow, look how grainy that is. And then on. Now, by contrast, let's go to this image. Let's leave this off for now in case we come back to this. Let's go over to this image. Turn that off. This image was shot at ISO 320 at the same f-stop, f8. Okay, so basically the same exposure. It looked like my daylight changed just a little bit in the couple of minutes while I was adjusting. But if we look at this image and we zoom in the shadow area, look how clean that looks. And we have no noise reduction on. This is on 0. Look how smooth everything looks. The in focus area is even crisper. The out of focus area is smoother. Let's compare the two of them. The high ISO image on the left, the low ISO on the right. Let's go to 100%. You can see that there's almost a mimicking of sharpness that goes on as the camera interprets what's going on, and it boosts the signal, and it creates supernaturally sharp portions of the image. But you look in the shadow area, look at the dramatic difference here and here, like sandpaper here and like butter over here. Let's go over to the wall, which is probably where the most dramatic difference is. So you're going to see the most dramatic differences, as I was mentioning, in those constant subtle gradations in wall textures and things like that. And you can see, so make sure this isn't doing anything. I'm going to shut that off entirely. There we go. Now, here's what we're talking about with that color artifacting. Look at the color that gets created. Red, blue, green, RGB. Those are the three primary colors that the camera sensors are using to process your images. Red, green, and blue. So when you get into these high ISO portions, it's taking all those three primary colors and then boosting them to the max. But it's the software that actually suppresses the color. See what happens? It's basically gone by the time we get to 42. It's not even necessary in the low ISO image. There's no reduction going on here, and it's very smooth. So this ought to be a good visual example of how ISO works. And then one last point, in order to compensate for my exposure, because ISO 20,000 is many stops greater than ISO 320, I was at 1/125th of a second, and I had to go all the way down to a half second in order to maintain the same or about equivalent exposure, because they're off by just a slight bit. So as I've been demonstrating with the exposure compensation, adjusting one of the tools to compensate for an increase in the other tool, the other control, The f-stop, ISO, and shutter must be used together to create an optimal exposure. It is a zero-sum situation, meaning you must use them all to reach balance. If you increase your shutter speed by 1 stop, you must reduce your f-stop by 1, or increase your ISO by 1 stop to maintain exposure. So increasing one tool, allowing more light in, you'll have to decrease one of your other controls to decrease the sensitivity or the amount of time that it's open. Those 3 tools have to be used together. So on your screen, you have 3 equivalent exposures. You have one exposure at f5.6, a 60th of a second, at ISO 400. Then let's say you wanted more depth of field, so you went to f8. Let's say you're shooting a landscape. f8 would be a much better aperture to shoot your landscape at. So you went to f8, which is minus 1 stop of light. And then let's say you had some moving branches in the scene and you wanted to increase your shutter speed. So you went to 1/25th of a second. Well, you've also lost a stop of light there. So in order to compensate, you would have to increase your ISO by 2 stops. So you'd have to go from 400 to 1600. Let's say you have another scenario. You went to f11 because you wanted yet more depth of field. So that's minus 2 stops from f5.6. Let's say that there's no motion in the scene, so it doesn't matter what your shutter speed is, and you went down to 1/8 of a second. Well, that'd be 3 stops more light. So there's an imbalance because you went down -2 on your f-stop, and you went up +3 on your shutter speed. Well, you'd have to go down 1 stop on your ISO, and now you've maintained equilibrium. You're back to 0. Think of balancing these 3 tools as finding a balance on a scale. Each of the tools weighs the same amount. They do different things though, so you might want to use one for artistic effect, but in order to get that artistic effect, you're going to have to sacrifice one of the other tools, one of the other units. So if you're trying to reach a balance, let's say this object over here represents my desired exposure, the exposure value, the brightness value. Well, I'm going to have to add 3 different units over here in order to reach equilibrium. I can add each of them in different amounts. It's totally up to me if I want to have a lot of shutter speed or if I want to have a lot of aperture depth of field. Well, I'm going to have to compensate by removing or subtracting one of the other tools in order to reach equilibrium. Because if I add too much light, it's going to be way out of balance. It's going to be way too bright. If I don't add enough, it's going to be way too dark and we won't have an image at all. So you have to find what your balance is by adding and removing in order to gain not just your artistic effect, the desired look of the image, but also the amount of light that is going to be allowed through has to equal the value of the brightness of the scene. I hope that this makes sense because it's not easy. It's not an easy concept. But trust me, the best way to get to understand this is to go and get your camera and start playing with those settings. Increase your shutter speed, reduce your shutter speed, photograph a moving object and see what happens to it. Start opening up your aperture as far as it can go. Then close it down as far as it can go. See what it does to the image. I think that you'll get to understand it very quickly once you start to play with it. Just don't forget that you have all 3 tools to be used. Your ISO, which is the sensitivity, the aperture, which is the throughput, the size of the opening, and the shutter speed, the amount of time that your shutter is going to be open. That's going to do it for Unit 8 of Camera Basics, where we talked all about the exposure triangle and the 3 primary controls of your camera. I hope that you enjoyed this lesson, and please feel free to watch this lesson as many times as you need so that you can understand these complex concepts. I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, keep shooting.